The double doors opened, and conversation ceased instantly. Two men entered first, 6 feet of controlled violence wrapped in bespoke suits. One was black, clean-shaven, eyes like a hawk scanning the Lakeshore Country Club ballroom. The other was white, broad-shouldered, his hand resting casually near his jacket, a tell to anyone who knew what to look for. They moved with military precision, each step measured and deliberate. Behind them walked a man in a charcoal 3-piece suit, his shoes clicking against the polished marble with the rhythm of inevitability. Ink climbed his neck from beneath his collar, stark against pale skin. A red pocket square provided the only splash of color, like a challenge or a warning. Sharp intakes of breath rippled through the crowd. Crystal champagne flutes paused mid-toast. Someone's hand jerked, sending an appetizer plate clattering onto fine china. The string quartet's violinist lost her rhythm entirely. Giovanna Buck's face went white as bone. Bentley Bryan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor, his prepared toast dying on his tongue. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan stretched dark and endless beyond the manicured grounds, the Chicago skyline glittering in the distance like a promise, or a threat, of how far power could reach. The man's gaze swept the room, not threatening, calculating. His voice, when it came, was quieter than expected. Professional. I received your invitation. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Tommy Watson meant twin in Aramaic, a name his mother had whispered at his baptism 28 years ago, clutching him close, as if she'd already known he'd be split in two, half heir to a criminal empire, half something that might have been decent. That mother was gone now, 12 years in the ground, having died in a car accident that everyone knew wasn't an accident. A message from a rival family. The price of being born into violence. The boy, now man standing in the doorway, had grown up in Chicago's North Shore suburbs, a neighborhood split between families who earned their wealth legitimately and those who took it through intimidation, extortion, and bodies that never surfaced from the lake. His uncle Vincent Watson had raised him after his mother's death, teaching him the family business the way other men taught their sons baseball. By age 12, Tommy could read a room for threats, identify exits, spot undercover police by the way they held themselves. At 15, he'd witnessed his first execution in a warehouse near the docks, watched a man beg before the gunshot silenced him forever. The other kids at Lakeshore North High had known something was off about Tommy Watson. They'd whispered mafia, gangster, dangerous, but from a safe distance because everyone knew his last name meant protection or consequences. By age 17, the violence had escalated to complicity. Vincent had ordered him to prove his loyalty, to make his bones, to cross the line that separated family from soldier. They'd brought a man to the warehouse, hands zip-tied behind his back, face already swollen from interrogation. Marco Delgado. A rat, Vincent said, a federal informant who'd betrayed their operation. Tommy had held the gun, felt its weight, looked into Marco's terrified eyes, and couldn't pull the trigger. Vincent's enforcers had beaten him unconscious in that same warehouse. He'd awakened hours later, dumped in an alley near the Indiana border with broken ribs and a message carved into his understanding. "You're dead to us." Then Tommy Watson had vanished from Chicago entirely. Bentley Bryan stood frozen now, 28 years old, his law degree from Northwestern still shiny with ambition, his confidence usually unshakable. His father had built Bryan and Associates into the legal shield for 3 crime families. The reunion had been Bentley's idea, a networking opportunity disguised as nostalgia, a chance to flaunt success in front of people who'd never amount to anything. Giovanna Buck clutched her champagne glass with white knuckles, her emerald dress perfectly tailored, her diamond ring catching the light like a warning flare. She'd been Tommy's first love, before she'd married Bentley for security, for legitimacy, for the future Tommy had stolen from her when he'd chosen exile. Marcus Chen, Tommy's former bodyguard, stood just behind him now, 32 years old, former Force Recon Marine, his dark suit concealing tactical gear. He'd learned that civilians were more dangerous than insurgents long before a federal witness had hired him for protection detail. Dante Williams pressed against Tommy's right side, 29 ex-Secret Service, his hand never far from his weapon. A man who understood that threats came from the people you least expected. 3 days before the reunion, Tommy's secure phone had buzzed in his modest Pilsen apartment, 10 years since he'd last lived in this city under his real name. Dr. Ellen Reyes, his therapist, had forwarded the invitation to his encrypted email. A cream-colored card with embossed lettering, Lakeshore North High, Class of 2015, 10-year reunion. Handwritten at the bottom in Bentley Bryan's distinctive scrawl, "Everyone's dying to see what happened to you." Marcus had examined the invitation like it was a potential IED, checking for toxins, tracking devices, hidden threats. "It's clean," he'd said finally. "Physically, at least. Psychologically, this is a trap." Tommy had sat at his kitchen table as evening fell over the city, drinking black coffee. The invitation lay between them on scarred wood. "You think they want to humiliate me?" Tommy said. Not a question. "They locked you out of everything that mattered when you were 17. Why would they want you there now, except to show everyone how far you've fallen?" Marcus's fingers drummed the table. "You're the cautionary tale. The heir who threw it all away." "Maybe," Tommy admitted. "Or maybe I need to see it one last time. The life I walked away from." Marcus's expression softened. "Boss, you've been running for 10 years. You've built a legitimate business. You've got federal prosecutors who owe you their careers. You don't need their validation." Tommy pulled out a leather wallet from his jacket, opened it to reveal a photograph. Faded, creased from years of carrying. Giovanna at 17, laughing on the beach, before everything went to hell. "I left her behind," he said quietly. "I never explained why. She thinks I abandoned her." "You were protecting her," Marcus said. "Vincent would have killed her to hurt you." "She doesn't know that. And I never told her because telling her meant exposing her to danger." Tommy closed the wallet. "Dr. Reyes says I can't move forward until I face what I left behind, that I'm still that terrified kid in the alley until I prove I survived." The decision crystallized in his chest. He would attend. The next morning, Tommy drove to Rose Hill Cemetery alone, though Marcus insisted on following in a second vehicle. Security protocol. Always have backup. Always have an exit. He hadn't visited since the day they'd buried Vincent, 6 months ago. Stomach cancer. The old man had died cursing Tommy's name, leaving behind a confession that shattered everything their family had built. Testimony the feds were still trying to decrypt. The Watson family plot sprawled across a shaded hillside, monuments to men who'd made fortunes through fear. His grandfather, his great-uncle, his mother, separated from them by 20 feet. Close enough to claim family, far enough to maintain the fiction of innocence. Tommy knelt at his mother's grave, the grass damp from morning dew. Elizabeth Ann Watson, beloved mother, 1979, 2013. "I got the invitation, Mom," he whispered to the granite. "To the reunion, Bentley's making it clear they want to mock me, show everyone what happens when you betray the family." The memory crashed over him. Reading Vincent's letter 5 years ago, understanding his mother's accident had been ordered by the Calabrese family as retaliation for a territorial dispute. That her death was a message. That everything Tommy thought he'd been protecting her from had found her anyway. Tommy had testified against the Calabreses after that, put 4 of them in federal prison. But he'd never touched Vincent's organization. Some lines, even for revenge, he couldn't cross. "I don't know why I'm going," he admitted to the stone. "Maybe to show them they didn't break me. Maybe to prove I survived despite everything they did." He touched the cold marble. I'm angry you're gone, and I'm angry you stayed with Vincent as long as you did. But I understand why. Marcus approached quietly, respectfully, gave Tommy space. Back at his apartment, Tommy made no effort to hide what he'd become. He kept his field clothes, the tactical boots, the custom-tailored suit that concealed body armor, the watch that doubled as an emergency beacon. These were the tools of survival, the uniform of a man who'd learned that power without conscience destroyed everyone it touched. He examined the invitation again. 10-year reunion, cocktails at 7 p.m. They'd been children then, supposed to be adults now. But Tommy had learned that age didn't guarantee wisdom. Sometimes people just became more sophisticated versions of their worst instincts. Some of them might have changed, Marcus warned, watching his employer pack. Some probably haven't. Bentley's still working for the same families that wanted you dead. I'm not going to forgive them, Tommy said flatly. I'm going to show them I survived despite them. That choosing conscience over loyalty didn't destroy me. It saved me. And that's enough? Marcus asked. Has to be, Tommy replied, because bearing witness to your own survival is sometimes the only victory you get. The leather wallet went into Tommy's jacket pocket. The photograph of Giovanna still tucked inside. He'd carried her memory for 10 years, unable to let go, unable to move forward. Perhaps tonight would change that. Perhaps not. Marcus and Dante positioned themselves at the door without being asked. They'd learned his moods, understood when he needed them most. Ready, boss? Marcus asked. Tommy's eyes met his steadily. No longer the terrified teenager who'd been beaten and abandoned, but not yet the man he was trying to become. Let's find out. The Lakeshore Country Club had been decorated with their old school colors, navy and silver, polished now like the wealth they'd inherited or stolen. A banner read, Class of 2015, a decade of excellence. Though excellence had meant very different things to different people. Someone had created a photo wall near the entrance. Yearbook pictures, frozen smiles with the casual cruelty of children who'd never been taught accountability. Quarterback Marcus Sullivan grinning beside debate team captain Kaya Thompson. Bentley Bryan in his Letterman jacket, arm around Giovanna Buck, even though everyone knew she'd been with Tommy then. About 40 people filled the ballroom, designer dresses and tailored suits, the uniform of those who'd succeeded, or at least learned to fake it convincingly. And then the doors opened, and silence fell like a blade. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under Tommy's apartment door in Pilsen like a ghost from a life he'd spent 10 years trying to forget. No return address, just the embossed lettering and Bentley's handwriting, confident and mocking in equal measure. Tommy had stood in his kitchen for 20 minutes, coffee going cold in his hand, staring at the cream-colored card. Marcus had found him there, still frozen, when he'd arrived for their morning security briefing. That's not good news, Marcus had observed, reading Tommy's expression before reading the invitation. It wasn't. But it was also inevitable. You couldn't run from your past forever. Eventually, it found your address. The memories came whether Tommy wanted them or not, flooding back with the force of a decade's worth of suppression, finally breaking through. He'd been 16 when he'd first kissed Giovanna Buck behind the football stadium, her laugh bright as summer, her hands tangled in his hair. She'd known who he was, what his family did, and she'd chosen him anyway. That had felt like salvation at the time, like maybe he could be more than Vincent Watson's heir. Promise me something, she'd whispered that night, her forehead pressed against his. Promise me you'll get out, that you won't become like them. He'd promised. God, he'd promised. But Vincent had other plans. The grooming had started young, subtle at first. Rides in expensive cars, meetings where Tommy sat silent, learning to read power dynamics in the tension between men's shoulders. Lessons in loyalty, in fear, in the mathematics of violence. This empire will be yours someday, Vincent had told him on his 17th birthday, overlooking the lake from a penthouse that had been purchased with blood money. "Everything I've built. But first, you have to prove you're worthy of it." Tommy had wanted to refuse even then, had felt the wrongness of it settling into his bones like a sickness. But Vincent was all the family he had left, and saying no to Vincent Watson wasn't an option. It was a death sentence. The waste management business was a fiction everyone maintained. The trucks existed, the contracts were real, but the money came from elsewhere. Protection rackets, gambling operations, loans with interest rates that destroyed families. Vincent ran it all with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 CEO and the conscience of a predator. Tommy had tried to stay on the periphery, to learn the legitimate side of the business, to convince himself he could inherit the empire and reform it from within. Giovanna had believed in that version of the future. They'd planned it together, late at night in his car, parked overlooking the lake. "You'll be different," she'd insisted. "You'll make it legitimate. I know you will." He'd wanted to believe her, had needed to believe redemption was possible. Then came the night that shattered everything. Vincent had called him to the warehouse near the docks, the one they used when things needed to disappear. Tommy had known immediately something was wrong. The air felt different, charged with violence waiting to happen. Marco Delgado was already there, zip-tied to a chair, his face purple with bruises, blood crusting his split lip. Two of Vincent's enforcers flanked him, silent and massive. Vincent had handed Tommy a gun. "This man betrayed us. He's been feeding information to the FBI. You know what happens to rats." Tommy's hand had shaken, taking the weapon. Marco's eyes had met his, terrified and pleading and utterly human. "Uncle Vincent, this is what it means to be family," Vincent had interrupted, his voice cold as winter. "This is the price of loyalty. You pull that trigger, or everything I've built, everything your grandfather built, dies with my weakness in raising you." The gun had felt impossibly heavy. Tommy had raised it, tried to steady his breathing, tried to become the person Vincent needed him to be. He couldn't do it. "I'm sorry," Tommy had whispered, lowering the weapon. "I can't." The disappointment in Vincent's eyes had been worse than any physical blow. But the physical blows had come anyway. Vincent had nodded to his enforcers. They'd moved with practiced efficiency. The first punch had doubled Tommy over. The second had dropped him to his knees. He'd stopped counting after that, curled on the concrete, tasting blood, feeling ribs crack, hearing Giovanna's voice in his head promising him he could be different. When they'd finally stopped, Vincent had crouched beside him, his voice almost gentle. "You're dead to us. You understand? You're not my nephew. You're not a Watson. You're nothing." They'd dumped him in an alley near the Indiana border, 30 miles from anywhere that mattered, left him bleeding in the darkness with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that he'd chosen conscience over survival. Tommy had thought he was dying, had wanted to die in those first agonizing hours. Instead, Marco Delgado had found him, had called an ambulance, had saved the life of the boy who'd refused to take his. "You did the right thing," Marco had told him in the hospital, revealing his FBI badge. "And now I'm going to help you disappear." That had been 10 years ago. Tommy had awakened in protective custody, a ghost, everyone he'd loved believing he was either dead or a coward who'd run. He'd never corrected them. Letting them think he'd fled was safer than them knowing the truth, that he'd broken the first and only rule that mattered in Vincent Watson's world. Never, ever refuse a direct order. Now, holding the reunion invitation, Tommy understood this wasn't about nostalgia or forgiveness. This was Bentley's way of dragging him back into the light, of showing everyone what happened to those who walked away from power. Marcus had watched him carefully. "You don't have to go." "Yes," Tommy had said quietly. "I do." Because Giovanna deserved to know why he'd vanished. and Tommy deserved to face the man he'd almost become. Tommy had awakened in Northwestern Memorial Hospital 3 days after the beating, his body wrapped in bandages and monitors, his identity already being erased from official records. Marco Delgado had been sitting in the chair beside his bed, reading a newspaper, looking nothing like a man who'd been hours away from execution. "You're awake," Marco had said, folding the paper. "Good, we have a lot to discuss." The badge had come out first, gold and legitimate, followed by identification that confirmed what Tommy had already suspected. Special Agent Marco Delgado, FBI Organized Crime Division, 5 years deep undercover in the Calabrese, family's money laundering operation. "You saved my life," Marco had said simply. "Now I'm going to save yours, but you need to understand what that means." What it meant was disappearing. Completely. The FBI had moved him to a safe house in suburban Milwaukee within a week, a bland apartment in a complex full of people who minded their own business. Tommy Watson officially ceased to exist. His phone went dead. His bank accounts frozen. Every digital footprint scrubbed clean by federal cybersecurity specialists who made it look like he'd never been born. Giovanna would think he'd abandoned her. His few remaining friends would assume he'd fled out of cowardice. Vincent would spread whatever story served him best, probably that Tommy had stolen money and run, that he'd always been weak, that blood meant nothing to traitors. Let them believe it. Believing he was a coward would keep them from looking too closely, from realizing he was in protective custody, from understanding he'd become the one thing Vincent had taught him to fear above all else: a witness. The work had started immediately. Federal prosecutors had set up in the safe house with file boxes and recording equipment, taking Tommy through everything he'd seen, heard, and learned in 17 years of being Vincent Watson's heir. He'd given them the Calabrese family first. Their shipping routes, their front companies, the politicians they'd purchased. Everything Marco had risked his life to uncover, Tommy confirmed and expanded. Within 6 months, 11 Calabrese soldiers and 3 family heads were indicted. 2 took plea deals, the rest went to trial. Tommy had testified behind a screen, voice modulated, face hidden. But his words had been devastating. The jury had deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Then came the Morellis. The Russos. Crime families Vincent had allied with, competed against, occasionally gone to war with. Tommy had mapped their entire organizational structure, identified their legitimate businesses, traced money flows through shell corporations and offshore accounts. The prosecutors had called him their golden boy, the gift that kept on giving. But they'd wanted Vincent too, had pushed him constantly to roll on his own family. "You have enough to put your uncle away for 3 lifetimes, Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen had argued, spreading photos across the table. Crime scenes, victims, families destroyed by Vincent's operations. Why protect him? Tommy hadn't had a good answer, just a feeling in his gut that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Testifying against his uncle meant accepting that every childhood memory, every moment of care Vincent had shown him, had been manipulation. It meant destroying the last connection to his mother, to his family name, to any sense of belonging. "I can't," Tommy had said finally. "Not yet." Chen had been frustrated but professional. "When you're ready, we'll be here." By year 3, the safe house had begun to feel less like protection and more like a prison. Tommy had been living under the name Thomas Wade, working construction jobs for cash, seeing the same 4 walls every night. The nightmares had gotten worse. Vincent's face, Marco's terror, the sound of his own ribs breaking, Giovanna's voice asking why he'd left. That's when the FBI had assigned Dr. Ellen Reyes. She'd arrived at the safe house on a Tuesday, professional in her tailored suit, carrying a leather bag full of psychological assessment tools Tommy had immediately recognized as an interrogation in disguise. "I'm not crazy," he'd said defensively. "No," she'd agreed, settling into the chair across from him, You're traumatized. There's a difference. And if you don't process what happened to you, it will destroy you more thoroughly than your uncle ever could. The sessions had been brutal. Dr. Reyes had refused to let him hide behind deflection or silence, had pushed him to articulate the guilt that woke him at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat. I broke my promise to Giovanna, he'd admitted during their 6th session. I told her I'd get out, that I'd be different. Instead, I got her hopes up and then disappeared without explanation. She probably thinks I chose the family over her. Did you? Dr. Reyes had asked. I chose not to murder someone. That's not the same as choosing the family. But you've never told her that. So she doesn't know you kept your real promise. The one about not becoming like them. The observation had gutted him. She was right. In trying to protect Giovanna by disappearing, he'd let her believe the worst possible version of his character. You can't fix the past, Dr. Reyes had said gently. But you can decide who you become next. Right now, you're defining yourself by what you lost. What if you defined yourself by what you're building? The idea had taken root slowly. If he couldn't be Vincent's heir, couldn't be Giovanna's boyfriend, couldn't even be Tommy Watson, what could he be? The answer had come during year 4, when his handler mentioned the FBI was hiring private security consultants for witness protection details. Former law enforcement, former military, people who understood threat assessment and could think tactically. Tommy had understood threats his entire life, had learned to read violence in the set of a man's shoulders, to identify exits and escape routes instinctively, to assess loyalty and betrayal by the smallest behavioral tells. I can do this, he'd told his handler. The training had been intense. Tactical driving, close protection protocols, weapons proficiency he'd already possessed, but now learned to deploy legally. Emergency medicine, risk assessment. Within a year, he'd earned his private investigator's license and security consultant certification. Thomas Wade Security Consulting had started small, just Tommy and a website. But word spread quickly in federal law enforcement circles. He was reliable, discreet, and had an almost preternatural ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. Marcus Chen had been his first hire, a Force Recon Marine looking for work after his discharge. Then Dante Williams, former Secret Service, disillusioned after losing a protectee to inadequate advance work. By year 5, they'd built something legitimate, something clean, something that helped people instead of destroying them. Dr. Reyes had smiled during their last official session. You did it. You built a new life. I'm still in hiding, Tommy had pointed out. No, she'd corrected. You're in transition. There's a difference. Hiding means running from the past. Transition means moving toward the future. Now, standing in his apartment with the reunion invitation in his hand, Tommy wondered if the transition was finally complete, or if he'd just been in denial about how much of the past still owned him. The valet had looked at Tommy's car like it personally offended him. A modest Honda Accord, practical and anonymous, parked between a Mercedes and a Tesla. Marcus had insisted on driving separately in the surveillance vehicle, maintaining tactical distance in case they needed to extract quickly. Dante had swept the country club perimeter twice before giving the all-clear. Old habits. The kind that kept people alive. Tommy had straightened his tie in the side mirror, feeling the weight of body armor beneath his tailored suit. The red pocket square was Dante's idea, a splash of confidence in a sea of navy and silver. Make them remember you chose to be here, Dante had said, not that you had to be. The walk from the parking lot to the entrance had felt longer than any approach Tommy had ever made. His shoes clicked against cobblestones, Marcus and Dante flanking him with the precision of a Secret Service detail, their presence announcing that Tommy Watson hadn't just survived, he'd evolved. The doorman had opened the double doors without comment, though his eyes had widened slightly at the bodyguards. Through the entrance, Tommy could see the ballroom bathed in golden light, hear the string quartet playing something classical and expensive, smell catered food and perfume and old money. Then they'd stepped inside, and the world had stopped. The silence had fallen like a physical thing, spreading from the entrance in ripples. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. A woman near the bar had actually dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering on marble with a sound like a gunshot that made Dante's hand twitch toward his jacket. Tommy had stood in that doorway, backlit by the evening sun, and felt every eye in the room assess him, judge him. Try to reconcile the scrawny teenager they remembered with the man who'd returned flanked by operators who moved like weapons. Marcus had scanned the room with professional detachment, cataloging exits, identifying potential threats, positioning himself to intercept anyone who approached too quickly. Dante had moved to Tommy's right, his posture relaxed but ready, a human barrier between his employer and a room full of people who'd once known him as prey. The whispers had started almost immediately, spreading like wildfire through the crowd. "Is that really Tommy Watson? I heard he was dead. My dad said the family disowned him. Look at those bodyguards. What the hell happened to him?" Tommy had let them stare, let them whisper. This was part of it. Reclaiming the narrative, showing them that exile hadn't broken him. If anything, it had forged him into something stronger than any of them had become. David Park had been the first to approach, cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal. He'd been on the soccer team, decent guy, never participated in the rumors but never defended Tommy either. Safe, neutral territory. "Tommy? Man, it's really you." David's eyes had flicked nervously to Marcus and Dante. We all thought. I mean, nobody knew what happened to you." "I left," Tommy had said simply. No explanation, no justification. Let them fill in the blanks themselves. "Yeah, but..." David had trailed off, clearly wanting to ask 1,000 questions and not daring to voice any of them. "You look good. Different. Are those bodyguards?" "Security consultants," Tommy had corrected gently. "I run a private firm now." The information had rippled outward as David retreated, absorbed by the crowd and immediately surrounded by people hungry for details. Tommy Watson was back. He had bodyguards. He looked expensive. He'd said he left, like it had been a choice. Sarah Kim had come next, braver or maybe just more curious. She'd been in his AP history class, smart and sharp-tongued, dating Marcus Sullivan back then. "You vanished without a trace," she'd said bluntly. "Your uncle told everyone you'd stolen money and run, that you were too weak for the family business." Tommy had smiled, thin and cold. "My uncle said a lot of things. Some of them were even true. But not that. Would I be here if I'd stolen from Vincent Watson? Would I be alive?" The question had hung in the air, its implications spreading like poison through water. If Vincent had lied about the theft, what else had he lied about? What had really happened to Tommy Watson? Across the room, Bentley Bryan had been watching the interactions with barely concealed irritation, his jaw tight, his champagne glass gripped too hard. He'd orchestrated this reunion as a victory lap, a chance to show everyone how successful he'd become, how well-connected, how powerful. Tommy's arrival had stolen his thunder completely. But it was Giovanna who held Tommy's attention, even as he made polite small talk with former classmates who'd never been friends. She stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline glittering behind her like a backdrop from a film, her emerald dress catching the light in ways that made his chest ache with memory. She'd been watching him since the moment he'd entered, her expression carefully neutral, her diamond ring catching light every time she raised her champagne glass to lips that never actually drank. Their eyes had met across the room 3 times now. Each time, she'd looked away first, but not before Tommy had seen something flicker in her expression. Anger? Hurt? Recognition of the man he'd become versus the boy he'd been? Marcus had leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only Tommy could hear. She's going to approach. Question is whether she brings the husband or comes alone. Either way, it's going to be ugly. Tommy had murmured back. You want to leave before it gets there? For a moment, Tommy had considered it. Considered walking back out those doors, returning to his safe, anonymous life, where the past stayed buried and old wounds stayed closed. Then Giovanna had set down her glass with deliberate precision, said something to Bentley that made his expression darken, and started walking directly toward Tommy with the kind of purpose that suggested this confrontation had been 10 years in the making. Marcus had straightened slightly. Dante's hand had drifted closer to his jacket. Tommy had stood his ground, watching the woman he'd once loved approach like a storm he'd been waiting for since the moment he'd accepted the invitation. Hello, Giovanna, he'd said when she was close enough to hear. Her eyes had been cold as lake ice in winter. We need to talk. Bentley had caught up to her halfway across the ballroom, his hand possessive on her elbow, his expression shifting from irritation to something uglier. Territorial. He'd always been like that, even in high school, the kind of man who measured his worth by what he could control. They'd approached together, Giovanna leading, Bentley slightly behind like a handler managing a weapon he wasn't entirely sure wouldn't backfire. The crowd had parted for them instinctively, sensing blood in the water, conversation dying in their wake. Even the string quartet had seemed to falter, their melody thinning into something discordant. Marcus and Dante had shifted subtly, creating space but maintaining proximity. Professional. Ready. Giovanna had stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Tommy could smell her perfume. Something expensive and unfamiliar. Nothing like the drugstore vanilla she'd worn at 17. Everything about her was curated now. Polished, the girl he'd loved buffed away beneath layers of designer clothing and calculated presentation. 10 years, she'd said, her voice low and dangerous. 10 years, Tommy. No phone call, no letter, no explanation. You just vanished like I meant nothing. Tommy had kept his expression neutral, letting her speak, knowing that anything he said right now would only pour gasoline on a fire that had been burning for a decade. Do you know what that did to me? Her voice had cracked slightly, real emotion bleeding through the anger. I waited for you. I defended you when everyone said, you'd stolen from your uncle and run. I told them you weren't a coward, that you'd never abandon me without a reason. I was so sure you'd come back. The words had landed like physical blows. Tommy had forced himself to breathe through them, to absorb the damage without flinching visibly. She deserved her anger, had earned it through years of unanswered questions. But you didn't come back, Giovanna had continued, her volume rising, drawing more attention. People were watching now, phones discreetly angled to record, sensing this was the real entertainment of the evening. You left everyone who loved you. Your uncle, your family. Me. You chose cowardice over loyalty. You proved everyone right about you. Bentley had stepped forward then, sensing his moment, his expression smug and condescending. He'd always been a performer, understanding instinctively when an audience needed a villain to complete the narrative. Look at you, Bentley had said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Playing dress-up with your hired muscle, pretending you've become something other than what you are. A coward who ran the moment things got difficult. Tommy had met Bentley's eyes steadily, saying nothing, his silence somehow louder than any rebuttal could have been. You're just another burnout, Bentley had continued, warming to his role, his voice carrying across the ballroom like he was delivering closing arguments. Probably living off settlement money from some lawsuit, hiring bodyguards to make yourself feel important. But we all know the truth. You're still the scared kid who couldn't handle the family business, who couldn't handle any kind of pressure. A few people had laughed, nervous and performative, following Bentley's lead like they were supposed to. Tommy had remained perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression calm to the point of emptiness. He'd learned this technique from Marco during his first year in protective custody. How to create space between stimulus and response. How to observe emotion without being consumed by it. The silence had stretched, uncomfortable, electric. Giovanna's anger had been real, burning bright and painful. But Bentley's performance had been exactly that. A show for the crowd, an attempt to humiliate someone he viewed as competition for status he hadn't actually earned. "Say something," Giovanna had demanded, her frustration sharpening into something desperate. "Defend yourself. Explain. Give me any reason why you left." Tommy had wanted to tell her. Had wanted to explain about the warehouse, about Marco zip-tied to the chair, about the gun in his hand and the choice he'd made, about Vincent's enforcers breaking his ribs, about awakening in a hospital with a new identity, and the knowledge that returning to her would make her a target. But words felt inadequate against the weight of her decade-long grief. And the truth would endanger her more than his silence ever could. If Bentley was still working for the families, if Vincent still had reach, if any of them suspected Tommy had been cooperating with federal prosecutors, Giovanna's association with him would paint a target on her back. So instead, he'd said quietly, "I'm sorry." The apology had seemed to enrage her more than any excuse would have. "That's it? That's all you have to say? I'm sorry?" "What do you want me to say, Giovanna?" Tommy had asked, his voice still calm, still controlled. "That I made mistakes? I did. That I hurt you? I know. That I had reasons you wouldn't understand? I did. But nothing I say right now will change what happened." Bentley had scoffed, theatrical and dismissive. Listen to him. Can't even commit to an actual explanation. Just vague allusions to reasons. You're pathetic, Watson. You always were. Marcus had tensed slightly at that, recognizing the escalation, the way Bentley was pushing for a reaction that would justify further humiliation. Dante's hand had drifted incrementally closer to his jacket, ready to intervene if the verbal assault became physical. But Tommy had simply looked at Bentley with something approaching pity. Bentley hadn't changed at all. Still measuring his worth by tearing others down, still performing for an audience, still fundamentally insecure beneath the expensive suit and inherited connections. "I'm not here to defend myself," Tommy had said, addressing both of them but looking at Giovanna. "I'm here because I was invited. Because I wanted to face the people I left behind. Because hiding forever isn't the same as healing." "Hiding?" Giovanna had repeated, her laugh bitter. "You call what you did hiding? Like you were protecting us? Like your absence was some kind of noble sacrifice?" The accuracy of her accusation had stung precisely because she'd meant it as sarcasm. She'd stumbled on the truth without recognizing it. "Believe whatever you need to," Tommy had said softly. "I can't control your narrative." "Unbelievable," Bentley had announced to the watching crowd, playing to them like a lawyer addressing a jury. "He shows up here with bodyguards and attitude and can't even explain himself. Can't even give the woman he supposedly loved a real answer. This is who Tommy Watson really is. A coward. A failure." Bentley's voice had cut off abruptly, his face draining of color, his hand clutching at his throat. His eyes had gone wide with sudden terror, his champagne glass slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble floor. Then he'd collapsed, his body convulsing, foam appearing at the corners of his mouth. Giovanna had screamed, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands hovering uselessly over his seizing form. And Tommy's training had kicked in with the cold precision of someone who'd spent 5 years studying how organized crime families eliminated their enemies. The convulsions had been violent, Bentley's body arching off the marble floor, his limbs jerking with the kind of uncontrolled spasms that suggested neurological damage. Foam had appeared at the corners of his mouth, tinged pink with blood where he'd bitten through his tongue. His eyes had rolled back, showing white, his breathing coming in harsh, rattling gasps. Chaos had erupted instantly. Someone had screamed, high and piercing. Chairs had scraped backward as people scrambled away from the scene. A woman near the bar had started crying hysterically. David Park had pulled out his phone, fingers shaking too badly to dial properly. "Call 911!" someone had shouted, their voice cracking with panic. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Is he having a seizure?" Somebody do something. But nobody had moved to actually help. They'd all just stood there, frozen by shock and wealthy people helplessness, the kind of paralysis that came from lives where emergencies were handled by other people. Doctors, lawyers, staff who were paid to manage unpleasant realities. Giovanna had dropped to her knees beside Bentley, her emerald dress pooling around her, her hands hovering over his convulsing body, like she was afraid to touch him, afraid of making it worse. "Bentley! Bentley, what's wrong? Somebody help him! Please!" Her voice had climbed toward hysteria, raw and terrified, stripped of all the polished sophistication she'd worn like armor moments before. Tommy had already been moving, his body responding before conscious thought could catch up. Years of tactical training, of medical emergency protocols, of studying how cartels and crime families eliminated targets in public spaces. All of it had crystallized into instant recognition. He'd dropped to his knees opposite Giovanna, his hands already checking Bentley's pulse, tilting his head to assess airway obstruction, his mind cataloging symptoms with clinical detachment, even as adrenaline flooded his system. Rapid onset, violent seizures, excessive salivation, respiratory distress, autonomic nervous system failure. "Marcus, call 911 now," Tommy had ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos with command authority. "Tell them suspected poisoning, organophosphate, or nerve agent. Victim needs atropine and immediate transport." Marcus had already had his phone out, was already speaking to dispatch with military precision, providing location, symptoms, victim's approximate age and weight. "Dante, secure the exits," Tommy had continued, his hands now working to turn Bentley into recovery position, preventing him from aspirating on his own vomit. "Nobody leaves. This wasn't an accident." The words had sent fresh ripples of panic through the crowd. Poisoning. Not an accident. Someone here had done this. Dante had moved immediately, positioning himself at the main entrance, his presence enough to stop the handful of people who'd been edging toward the doors. "Security lockdown," he'd announced, his voice calm but absolute. "Everyone stays until police arrive." Giovanna had been staring at Tommy with wild, confused eyes, her hands still hovering uselessly. "What are you doing? What do you mean poisoning? This is just... He must be having an allergic reaction or..." "Giovanna, look at me," Tommy had said, his voice firm but not unkind, forcing her to focus through the panic. "I need you to tell me exactly what Bentley ate and drank in the last 30 minutes. Everything." I can't." She'd been spiraling, her breath coming too fast, shock setting in. "Giovanna," Tommy had repeated, more forcefully. "Focus. His life depends on this. What did he consume?" The direct demand had cut through her hysteria. She'd taken a shuddering breath, her mind working despite the terror. "Champagne. He's been drinking champagne all night, and he had some of the canapes, the ones with the crab, and..." Her voice had broken. "He took a drink from my glass earlier, when his was empty, but I'd barely touched it." Tommy's mind had been racing, calculating timelines and delivery methods. If it was the champagne, others would be showing symptoms by now. If it was the food, same problem. But if someone had specifically targeted Bentley's drink, or if the poison had been added recently to something only he'd consumed. Bentley's convulsions had begun to slow, his body going terrifyingly still, his breathing becoming shallow and irregular. Tommy had checked his pulse again. Weak, thready, failing. "Stay with me, Bentley," Tommy had said, though he wasn't sure if the man could even hear him. "Ambulance is coming. Just stay with me. Sarah Kim had pushed through the crowd, her face pale but determined. I'm a nurse. What can I do? Thank God. Help me monitor his breathing. If he stops, we start CPR immediately. Marcus had appeared at Tommy's shoulder, phone still pressed to his ear. Ambulance is 3 minutes out. Dispatch wants to know if you can identify the specific agent. Tommy had been scanning Bentley's symptoms again, his training and cartel methodology clicking into place. The rapid onset suggested something fast-acting. The specific symptom pattern, excessive salivation, respiratory failure, seizures, pointed to cholinergic crisis. Tell them it presents like organophosphate poisoning, Tommy had said. But the delivery was too precise, too targeted. This is professional work. The implications of that statement had hung in the air. Professional work. Meaning someone had specifically tried to kill Bentley Bryan at his own reunion, in front of 40 witnesses, with the kind of poison that required either specialized knowledge or organized crime connections. Giovanna had been staring at Tommy with an expression that suggested her entire understanding of reality was fracturing. How do you know all this? How do you know what's wrong with him? Tommy had met her eyes briefly, seeing the question beneath the question. How did Tommy Watson, the boy who'd supposedly run away because he was too weak for violence, suddenly possess the kind of knowledge that came from studying assassination techniques? I'll explain later, he'd said. Right now we need to keep him alive. Sirens had been audible in the distance, growing louder, the sound of help that might arrive too late. Bentley's pupils had been fixed and dilated, his body slack, his breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. Come on, Tommy had muttered, maintaining Bentley's airway, monitoring for any change. Don't you die. Not like this. Not before Tommy could tell Giovanna the truth. Not before she understood why he'd left. Not before any of this made sense. The ballroom doors had burst open, paramedics rushing in with equipment and urgent competence, taking over the scene with practiced efficiency. Tommy had moved back, giving them space, his hands covered in Bentley's saliva and blood, his expensive suit ruined, his heart hammering with adrenaline come down. Marcus had been at his side immediately. Boss, we need to talk. I saw someone leave through the kitchen exit right after Bentley collapsed. Male, mid-30s, server's uniform. Tommy had nodded, his mind already shifting into investigative mode. This wasn't just a medical emergency. This was an attempted assassination. And everyone in this room was either a suspect, a witness, or potentially the next target, including Giovanna, who was currently being pulled away from Bentley's unconscious body by paramedics, her dress stained with champagne and blood, her face a mask of incomprehension and terror. The ambulance had taken Bentley with sirens wailing, paramedics working frantically to stabilize him, even as they loaded him into the vehicle. Giovanna had climbed in beside him without hesitation, her face pale as death. Her earlier anger at Tommy, completely forgotten in the face of her husband's potential mortality. Tommy had watched them go, standing in the country club's entrance, the October wind cold against his skin. Marcus had appeared at his shoulder, his expression grim, holding a plastic evidence bag containing a champagne flute he'd secured before anyone could contaminate the scene. Cops are on their way, Marcus had said quietly. Detective unit, not just patrol. Someone called it in as suspicious circumstances. Good, Tommy had replied, though his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating consequences. The police would want statements. They'd want to know why Tommy Watson had possessed the knowledge to identify organophosphate poisoning. They'd want to know about the man who'd fled through the kitchen. They'd want to know why Tommy had chosen to save the life of a man who'd just publicly humiliated him. Inside the ballroom, Dante had been corralling witnesses, taking names and contact information, his Secret Service training converting chaos into organized documentation. The guests had been subdued now, shocked into compliance, their earlier excitement at witnessing drama curdled into the reality of being potential witnesses to attempted murder. "We should leave before the cops arrive," Marcus had suggested. "You don't need this kind of exposure, not with your history." Tommy had considered it. His identity as Thomas Wade would unravel under serious police scrutiny. Questions would be asked. The FBI would be notified. His carefully constructed new life would fracture. But leaving now meant abandoning Giovanna to face this alone. Meant not seeing through what he'd started when he'd dropped to his knees beside Bentley's convulsing body. "No," Tommy had said. "We stay. We cooperate. We tell them what we saw." Marcus had looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Boss, think this through. Bentley Bryan's law firm represents half the organized crime families in Chicago. If this is a hit, and we both know it is, then you just stepped into the middle of a mob war by saving him. Every family on both sides of this conflict is going to want to know who you are, what you know, and why you intervened." "I know," Tommy had said quietly, "but I couldn't just watch him die." "Even after everything he said to you? After he called you a coward in front of everyone?" Tommy had turned to face Marcus fully. "Especially then. Because if I'd walked away, if I'd let him die because he hurt my feelings, then I'd be exactly what he accused me of being. I'd be proving Vincent was right. That I'm too weak to make hard choices." Marcus had exhaled slowly, recognizing the futility of arguing. "You know what Dr. Reyes would say about this? That you're trying to prove something that doesn't need proving. Maybe," Tommy had admitted. "Or maybe I'm finally becoming who I was supposed to be before Vincent twisted me into something else." The police had arrived minutes later. 3 squad cars followed by an unmarked sedan carrying Detective Lisa Chen, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of patient intensity that suggested she rarely missed details. She'd taken one look at the scene, the crowd of wealthy witnesses, the evidence of violence, Tommy and his bodyguards standing apart like they didn't quite belong, and her expression had sharpened with interest. "Who called it in as poisoning?" she'd asked, her notebook already out. Dante had raised his hand. "I did, ma'am, based on the victim's symptoms and my colleague's assessment." Her eyes had shifted to Tommy. "And you are?" "Thomas Wade," Tommy had said, using his legal name, knowing it would eventually lead back to his real identity, but buying time. "I run a private security firm. I was attending the reunion as a guest." "But you know how to identify poisoning," Chen had observed, not quite a question. "I have tactical medicine training, part of my security certification." She'd studied him for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but unable to identify exactly what. "The victim is Bentley Bryan. You know him?" "We went to high school together," Tommy had said carefully. "We weren't friends." "But you tried to save his life anyway." "Yes." "That's interesting," Chen had said, her tone suggesting it was more than interesting. It was suspicious. "Most people wouldn't risk themselves for someone they dislike, especially when they show up to a reunion with bodyguards." Tommy had held her gaze steadily. "Most people aren't trained to respond to medical emergencies. I am. And regardless of our history, I wasn't going to watch someone die when I had the knowledge to help." Chen had made a note, her pen scratching across paper. "Noble. We'll need formal statements from all 3 of you. And I'll need to know why you think this was poisoning specifically, not a heart attack or allergic reaction." Marcus had stepped forward then, holding up the evidence bag. "We secured the victim's glass before the scene could be contaminated. You'll want to test for organophosphates, specifically something in the carbamate family. Fast-acting, precise dosing, symptoms consistent with cholinergic crisis." Chen had taken the bag, her expression shifting from skeptical to intensely focused. "That's very specific knowledge for a security consultant." "We've dealt with this kind of thing before," Marcus had said evenly. "Corporate espionage, workplace sabotage. You learn to recognize patterns." It was a good cover story, close enough to truth to be believable. Chen hadn't looked entirely convinced, but she'd bagged the evidence properly, labeled it, and handed it to one of the uniformed officers. The victim's wife went with him to Northwestern Memorial, Chen had said, flipping through her notes. Giovanna Bryan, née Buck. You know her? Tommy's chest had tightened. We dated in high school. We haven't spoken in 10 years. Until tonight. Until tonight. Chen had been quiet for a moment, processing the layers of complication. So you show up to a reunion after a decade, encounter your ex-girlfriend who's now married to someone you went to school with but weren't friends with. He publicly insults you based on multiple witness statements, and then he collapses from what you immediately identify as poisoning. And despite your history, despite his treatment of you tonight, you immediately move to save his life. When she laid it out like that, it did sound suspicious, or insane, or both. That's what happened, Tommy had confirmed. You understand I'm going to need a lot more detail than that. Starting with why you really left Chicago 10 years ago, why you changed your name, and why someone with your particular skill set is working private security instead of law enforcement. Tommy had exchanged a glance with Marcus. The moment of truth, then. The point where his carefully constructed civilian life collided with the reality of who he'd been and what he'd done. I'd prefer to discuss that at the station, Tommy had said carefully, with my lawyer present, and possibly with a call to the FBI. Chen's eyebrows had risen. FBI? This just gets better and better. It's complicated, Tommy had said, which was possibly the understatement of the decade. I'm sure it is, Chen had replied, which is why you're coming downtown with me. Your bodyguards can follow separately. She'd paused, studying him with something that might have been respect, or might have been calculation. For what it's worth, Mr. Wade, or whatever your real name is, I think you did the right thing tonight. Not many people would have. Tommy had nodded, accepting the compliment for what it was. A temporary acknowledgement before the real interrogation began. As they'd walked toward Chen's sedan, Tommy's phone had buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Northwestern Memorial, ICU waiting room. Please come. G. Giovanna. Reaching out after 10 years of silence, asking him to come to her. Tommy had shown the text to Chen. She'd read it, sighed, and adjusted their trajectory. Hospital first, then the station. But Wade, whatever history you're running from, it's about to catch up. I know, Tommy had said quietly. That's why I came back. Northwestern Memorial's ICU waiting room had the sterile, timeless quality of all hospital spaces. Fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. Chairs designed for temporary discomfort. Magazines from 3 months ago that nobody read. The coffee machine in the corner dispensed something that approximated caffeine but tasted like regret. Tommy had arrived to find Giovanna alone, still in her emerald dress now ruined with stains, her makeup smeared from crying, her diamond ring catching the harsh light as she twisted it compulsively around her finger. She'd looked up when he'd entered, her expression cycling through surprise, relief, and something more complicated that might have been shame. Detective Chen had stationed herself near the entrance, giving them space but maintaining visual contact, clearly not trusting Tommy to remain a cooperative witness without supervision. Marcus and Dante had taken positions on either side of the waiting room, their presence drawing concerned looks from nurses, but no actual objection. You came, Giovanna had said, her voice hoarse from crying. Tommy had sat down 2 chairs away from her, close enough to talk quietly, but far enough to respect whatever boundaries she needed. You asked me to. I know, but after everything I said. Her voice had broken. After how I treated you, I wouldn't blame you for staying away. How is he? She'd wrapped her arms around herself, defensive and vulnerable simultaneously. They're not telling me much. Induced coma. Something about multiple organ failure. They keep using words like critical and touch and go and asking if he has any allergies to medications. A bitter laugh had escaped her. I don't even know if my husband is allergic to anything. What kind of wife doesn't know that? The kind who married for the wrong reasons, Tommy had said quietly. Giovanna had looked at him sharply, then away, her jaw tight. They'd sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the quiet beeping of medical equipment down the hall and the hum of the fluorescent lights above them. I married him 6 months after you disappeared, she'd said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone said I was moving on too fast, that I should wait, that you might come back. But I couldn't afford to wait. Tommy had felt something cold settle in his chest. What do you mean, afford? She'd twisted the ring harder, like she was trying to pull it off, but couldn't quite commit. Your uncle came to see me, 3 weeks after you vanished. He sat in my living room and told me very politely that you'd stolen from the family, that you'd betrayed everyone who trusted you, that if I knew where you were, I should tell him immediately. Giovanna, he was threatening me, Tommy. Her eyes had met his, angry and frightened and exhausted. He never said it directly, but I understood. If I knew anything, if I helped you, if I even talked about you too much, there would be consequences. So I needed protection. I needed to align myself with someone powerful enough that Vincent Watson wouldn't see me as a loose end. The truth had hit Tommy like a physical blow. She'd married Bentley not for love, but for survival. Because Tommy's choice to walk away had painted a target on her back that she'd spent 10 years trying to erase. Bentley's father was Vincent's lawyer, Giovanna had continued, her voice hollow. Everyone knew the Bryans were connected, that they had relationships with every family in Chicago. Marrying Bentley meant I was under their protection, that I was useful, not dangerous. So I did it. I married him, and I convinced myself it was what I wanted. Tommy had leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. I never meant for that to happen. I thought leaving would keep you safe. Safe from what? Giovanna had demanded, her anger flaring again. You never told me. You just disappeared and let me think you'd chosen the family over me, that I hadn't been enough. The waiting room had felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in. Tommy had spent 10 years protecting this secret, protecting her through distance and silence. But she'd paid the price anyway, had lived with the consequences of his choice without ever understanding why he'd made it. I refused an order, Tommy had said finally, his voice low and controlled. Vincent told me to kill someone, to prove my loyalty to the family, to make my bones like it was some kind of graduation ceremony into the life. Giovanna had gone very still. I couldn't do it, Tommy had continued. The man was zip-tied to a chair, already beaten, terrified. Vincent handed me a gun and told me to pull the trigger, and I couldn't. I just couldn't. Oh my God, Giovanna had whispered. Vincent's enforcers beat me unconscious, broke 3 ribs, fractured my jaw, internal bleeding. They dumped me in an alley near the Indiana border and told me I was dead to the family, that I was nothing, that if I ever came back, they'd finish the job. Tommy had forced himself to look at her, to let her see the truth in his eyes. The man I refused to kill was FBI. He found me in that alley and saved my life. Got me into protective custody, gave me a new identity. I wanted to contact you. God, Giovanna, I wanted to explain. But if Vincent knew I was alive, if he suspected I'd seen you or talked to you, you would have become leverage, a way to hurt me. I left you behind to protect you. Tears had been streaming down Giovanna's face, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. You were protecting me. All this time I thought you'd chosen them, that you'd proven everyone right about the Watsons, that violence and power mattered more to you than I did. You were the only thing that mattered, Tommy had said, his own voice rough with emotion. That's why I stayed away, because loving you meant keeping you alive, even if it meant you hated me for the rest of your life. She'd made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. I built an entire life based on a lie. I married a man I don't love, joined a world I despise, all because I thought you'd abandoned me, and you were just trying to keep me safe." "I'm sorry," Tommy had said. "I should have found a way to tell you. Should have trusted you with the truth instead of making decisions for you. I took away your choice, and that was wrong." Giovanna had covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Tommy had wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but the distance between them felt measured in more than chairs, in years of misunderstanding, in the ruins of the life they'd planned together, in the reality that she was married to someone else, and he'd become someone she didn't recognize. After several minutes, she'd lowered her hands, wiping at her eyes with the heel of her palm. "The man you refused to kill. Was it worth it? Losing everything?" Tommy had thought about Marco, about the 3 crime families behind bars, about the legitimate business he'd built, about Marcus and Dante and Dr. Reyes, about the version of himself who could sleep at night because he hadn't pulled that trigger. "Yes," he'd said simply. "It was worth it. Because the alternative was becoming Vincent. And I'd rather lose everything than become him." Giovanna had nodded slowly, processing, trying to reconcile the boy she'd loved with the man sitting beside her. "Who are you now, Tommy Watson?" "I don't know yet," he'd admitted, still figuring that out. A doctor had appeared in the doorway then, surgical mask pulled down, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Giovanna had stood immediately, bracing herself for whatever came next. "Mrs. Bryan, your husband is stable, critical but stable." The relief had been visible on Giovanna's face, her shoulders dropping, a sob catching in her throat. The doctor had continued with medical terminology that essentially meant Bentley would survive but faced a long recovery, potential organ damage, weeks or possibly months of treatment. Giovanna had nodded through it all, processing information while still visibly in shock. Tommy had stepped back, giving her space to absorb the news, when Dante had appeared at his elbow with a tablet displaying grainy security footage. His expression had been grim, professional, the look of someone who'd found exactly what they'd been looking for and wished they hadn't. "Boss, you need to see this," Dante had said quietly, angling the screen away from where Detective Chen could observe. The footage showed the country club's service entrance, time-stamped 20 minutes before Bentley's collapse. A man in server's uniform had entered carrying a standard catering tray, but something about his movement had been wrong. Too purposeful. Too aware of camera angles. "Watch his hands," Dante had instructed, advancing the footage frame by frame. The man had paused near the bar where the champagne service was being coordinated, his body momentarily blocking the camera's view of the glasses. 3 seconds of obstruction. Then he'd moved on. Tray balanced professionally. Just another server in a room full of them. He knew exactly where to stand, Tommy had observed. Knew the camera placement, knew the service pattern. "Gets better," Dante had said, pulling up a second angle. "Watch him leave." 15 minutes after Bentley's collapse, the same man had exited through the kitchen, moving faster now, no longer performing the role. He'd stripped off the server's jacket in the parking lot, revealing a plain black t-shirt underneath, and climbed into a nondescript sedan that had been idling near the service road. Dante had zoomed in on the license plate. "Car's registered to a shell company. Took me 20 minutes to trace it back, but I found the connection." He'd pulled up a series of corporate documents on the tablet, layers of ownership obscured through multiple LLC registrations. Shell company is owned by another shell company, which is owned by a holding company registered to an address in Little Italy. Tommy's stomach had tightened. Calabrese territory. "Exactly," Dante had confirmed. "And it gets worse. I ran facial recognition on the server through our database. Name's Anthony Russo. Did 3 years for aggravated assault. Released 18 months ago. Known associate of the Calabrese organization." The pieces had clicked into place with sickening clarity. The Calabreses were one of the families Tommy had helped put away during his cooperation with federal prosecutors. He'd testified against 11 of their soldiers, dismantled their money laundering operation, cost them millions in seized assets. They'd been rebuilding slowly over the past few years, carefully avoiding federal attention. But if they were targeting Bentley Bryan now, it meant something bigger was happening. Something that connected to Tommy's past in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Why Bentley?" Tommy had asked, though he was already forming the answer. Dante had pulled up more documentation. "I did some digging on Bryan and Associates while we were waiting. The firm represents 17 different businesses, most of them legitimate fronts, but 3 of them, a waste management company, a construction firm, and a shipping logistics operation, all have ties to families that the Calabreses are currently at war with. Bentley's been laundering money for their rivals," Tommy had said quietly. "More than that. His firm handles all their legal protections, incorporation documents, real estate transactions, contract negotiations. He's not just their lawyer. He's their infrastructure. Taking him out doesn't just kill one person. It destabilizes an entire network." Marcus had joined them, having noticed their intense conversation. This was never about the reunion. They used the event as cover. Public space, multiple witnesses, easy access through catering staff. By the time anyone realized it was poisoning, the assassin would be long gone. Tommy had looked across the waiting room to where Giovanna was still speaking with the doctor, unaware that her husband had been targeted not randomly but deliberately, that his entire practice was built on foundations of organized crime, that she'd married into danger thinking she was marrying into safety. "We need to contact Marco," Tommy had said, making the decision even as it formed. "This is bigger than attempted murder. This is RICO territory. Organized crime, conspiracy, potentially dozens of connected cases." "Boss," Marcus had warned, "if you bring in the FBI, your cover is blown completely. Everyone will know Thomas Wade is really Tommy Watson. Your cooperation with federal prosecutors, your testimony, everything comes out. Vincent will know you're alive. The families you testified against will know. You'll be painting a target on yourself." "I know," Tommy had said. "But if I don't, they'll just try again. They'll go after Bentley when he's vulnerable in the hospital, or they'll go after Giovanna to send a message. And I didn't spend 10 years building a new life just to watch people die because I was too afraid to expose myself." Dante had nodded slowly. "This is the right call. Morally speaking. Tactically speaking, it's probably going to get us all killed." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Tommy had replied dryly. He'd pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. Marco Delgado had answered on the 3rd ring, his voice cautious. "Thomas? Is that you? It's me, and I need you to come to Northwestern Memorial immediately. We have an attempted assassination connected to the Calabrese organization, and it ties into active mob conflict. I'm bringing in Detective Lisa Chen from Chicago PD. This needs to be a joint operation." There had been a pause, heavy with implication. "Tommy, if I come there, if we coordinate with local PD, your identity becomes part of the official record. You understand that?" "I understand. But there's a woman here who's in danger because of choices I made 10 years ago. I'm not letting her pay the price for my protection anymore." "The woman from your statements, Giovanna." "Yes." Marco had exhaled slowly. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. And Tommy? This is going to change everything." "I know," Tommy had said. "That's why I'm doing it." He'd ended the call and approached Detective Chen, who'd been watching his interaction with interest. "Detective, I need to make a formal statement, but I need to make it to both you and the FBI simultaneously. This case is connected to ongoing federal investigations into organized crime." Chen had studied him with the expression of someone whose suspicions were being confirmed in uncomfortable ways. "Federal witness protection?" "Former cooperating witness, the man who almost died tonight. His law firm has been providing legal infrastructure for multiple crime families. The assassination attempt was orchestrated by the Calabrese organization as part of a territorial conflict." "And you know this because?" Because I helped put the Calabresi's away 5 years ago, Tommy had said, his voice steady despite the weight of revelation. My real name is Tommy Watson, Vincent Watson's nephew, and 10 years ago I refused to commit murder for my uncle, which resulted in me entering federal protective custody and becoming a witness against 3 separate crime families. Chen had gone very still. Vincent Watson. As in the Vincent Watson currently under federal investigation for racketeering? The same. She'd closed her notebook slowly, her expression shifting from detective to someone who'd just realized they were standing in the middle of something much larger than a poisoning case. Mr. Watson, I think we need to have a much longer conversation. I know, Tommy had said, and I'm ready to tell you everything. Across the room, Giovanna had turned from her conversation with the doctor, her eyes finding Tommy's. Even from that distance, he could see the question forming. What happens now? Tommy wished he had a better answer than the truth. Everything was about to change, and there was no going back. 6 months later, the Dirksen Federal Building Courthouse felt less like a place of justice, and more like a mausoleum for the living. Tommy sat in the witness box, his hand resting on a Bible he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, swearing to tell the truth about things that had haunted him for 28 years. Vincent Watson sat at the defense table, 71 years old now, his hair white, his expensive suit unable to hide the weight loss from the stress of federal prosecution. He looked smaller than Tommy remembered, diminished, like the monster of his childhood had been revealed as just a man. Cruel, yes, but ultimately as mortal and fallible as anyone else. Their eyes had met once when Tommy had entered the courtroom. Vincent's expression had been unreadable, somewhere between disappointment and something that might have been pride. As if even now, even with Tommy testifying to put him away for the rest of his life, Vincent couldn't help but recognize that this act required a different kind of strength than what he'd tried to teach. The testimony had been methodical and devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen, no relation to the detective who'd started this chain of events, had walked Tommy through his childhood, his grooming, the night he'd refused to execute Marco Delgado, and everything that had followed. 10 years of observation, of being Vincent Watson's heir and witness to crimes that would now be catalogued in federal record. Can you describe for the jury what your uncle said when he handed you the weapon? Chen had asked, her voice professional but not unkind. Tommy had glanced at the jury, 8 women, 4 men, faces ranging from sympathetic to horrified, and chosen his words carefully. He said, "This is what it means to be family. This is the price of loyalty. You pull that trigger or everything I've built dies with my weakness in raising you." Vincent's lawyer had objected, called it hearsay, been overruled. The words had hung in the air of the courtroom like an indictment of everything the Watson name had ever stood for. In the gallery, Giovanna had been watching with an expression Tommy couldn't quite read. She'd cut her hair shorter since the reunion, looked tired, but also somehow lighter, like she'd been carrying weight for years and had finally set it down. The divorce papers had been filed 3 months ago. Bentley had survived the poisoning, but faced his own federal charges for money laundering and conspiracy. His law firm had been seized, his assets frozen, his carefully constructed legitimate facade dismantled by the same investigators who'd once relied on his family's legal expertise. Marcus sat 2 rows behind Giovanna, his presence no longer that of a bodyguard, but of family. Dante was beside him, both of them in suits instead of tactical gear, but still maintaining the awareness that came from years of expecting threats from every direction. The cross-examination had been brutal. Vincent's defense attorney trying to paint Tommy as a coward, a traitor, someone seeking revenge for being excluded from the family business. But Tommy had remained calm, had answered every question with the kind of measured honesty that Dr. Reyes had spent years helping him cultivate. "Isn't it true you testified against 3 other families before agreeing to testify against your uncle?" the defense attorney had pressed. Yes, Tommy had confirmed. And isn't it true you profited from your cooperation, built a business, created a new life? I built a legitimate business, yes, after 10 years of rebuilding myself into someone who could function in society. And now you've come here to destroy the man who raised you, who gave you everything. He gave me trauma, Tommy had interrupted, his voice quiet but absolute. He gave me nightmares. He gave me the choice between becoming a murderer or losing everything. That's not a gift. That's abuse. The courtroom had gone silent. Even Vincent's attorney had seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. RICO violations, conspiracy, extortion, witness intimidation, and a dozen other charges that would ensure Vincent Watson would die in federal prison. Tommy had felt nothing when the verdict was read. No triumph, no relief. Just the quiet acknowledgement that something that should have ended years ago had finally concluded. Now, 3 hours after the verdict, he sat in a coffee shop in the Loop with Giovanna across from him, 2 paper cups of coffee between them that neither had touched. The evening rush was building outside the windows, people heading home from work, living ordinary lives that Tommy was still learning to navigate. "How are you feeling?" Giovanna had asked. Tommy had considered the question honestly. Like I just closed a door I should have closed 10 years ago. Like I'm finally free to figure out who I am without Vincent's shadow. "I know that feeling," she'd said quietly. "Bentley's pleading out. His lawyer says 5 to 7 years if he cooperates. My lawyer says the divorce should be final in 3 months. I'm sorry it came to this." She'd smiled, sad but genuine. "I'm not. I spent 10 years in a marriage that was really just protective custody with better furniture. At least now I get to choose what comes next." They'd sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that only existed between people who'd survived something together. "I'm not the same person you fell in love with," Tommy had said finally. "I'm not sure I even know who that person was." "I know," Giovanna had replied, "and I'm not the girl who made you promise to get out. We're different people now, survivors of the same storm, but heading in different directions. Can we be friends? Is that possible?" She'd reached across the table, her hand covering his briefly. "I think we already are, and maybe that's better than what we were. More honest, at least." Tommy had nodded, accepting the truth of it. They would never be lovers again, would never reclaim what they'd lost. But they'd given each other something more valuable: the truth, and the freedom to move forward without carrying 10 years of misunderstanding. Outside the coffee shop, Marcus and Dante had been waiting by Tommy's car, their presence no longer just professional obligation, but genuine care. Dr. Reyes had called earlier to congratulate him on the testimony, to remind him that healing wasn't linear, but that he was making progress. Marco Delgado had sent a text. "Proud of you. Let's grab a beer next week." This was his chosen family now, the people who'd helped him build a life beyond violence, beyond the Watson name, beyond the boy who'd been handed a gun and told to become a monster. Tommy had walked Giovanna to her car, exchanged a careful hug that felt like both goodbye and permission to heal separately. Then he'd joined Marcus and Dante, 3 men who'd found each other through tragedy and trauma, and had decided that was enough to build something resembling belonging. "Where to, boss?" Marcus had asked, though his tone suggested he already knew Tommy hated being called that. "Home," Tommy had said, "and stop calling me boss. We're partners." Dante had grinned. "Never going to happen, boss." Tommy had climbed into the passenger seat, letting Marcus drive, letting himself be taken care of for once instead of always being the one maintaining vigilance. Through the car window, Chicago had spread out in all directions, the city where he'd been born, where he'd been broken, where he'd finally learned that the strongest thing a person could do wasn't pulling a trigger or maintaining loyalty to violence. It was walking away. It was choosing conscience over power. It was building something new from the ruins of what you'd been forced to leave behind. Vincent Watson would die in prison. Bentley Bryan would serve his time. The Calabrese family's attempted assassination had triggered federal investigations that were still unfolding, revealing layers of corruption that would take years to fully prosecute. But Tommy Watson, formerly Thomas Wade, formerly a scared 17-year-old with a gun he couldn't fire, was finally, genuinely free. And that was worth everything it had cost. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.